Dear colleagues, can I ask you to take your seats? We will start the hearing. So it is my pleasure as chair of the IMCO committee to welcome Commissioner-designate Mrs. Sylvie Goulard, and next to me, my co-chair of the Committee of Industry, Research and Energy of ITRE, who will chair this meeting together with me because we have a joint hearing, as you know. I also want to welcome the representatives of URI and CULT, associated committees, and of TRAN and SEDE subcommittee invited to this hearing. It is also, as a way of introduction, from IMCO, clear that we are... Yes, thank you, colleague. We are, of course, in our competencies, responsible for the functioning of the single market, including for measures aimed at the identification and removal of potential obstacles to the implementation of the single market, both online and offline, for the promotion and protection of the economic interests of consumers, as well as for policy and legislation regarding the enforcement on the single market rules and consumer rights. The IMCO committee is therefore very much looking forward to this hearing to understand better the approach of Mrs. Goulard in relation to these fields, as well as to know how the Commissioner-designate intends to tackle the challenges in these areas. I want to recall that a single market for goods and services is fully beneficial to consumers and businesses on the condition that rules are equally enforced throughout the European Union, of course. It is therefore necessary to continue strengthening the internal market, avoiding fragmentation and artificial divisions between the new digital markets and more traditional markets, ensuring that the existing rules are properly and timely implemented and enforced. I therefore want to highlight that within this framework, the services sector in all its dimensions is fundamental to the European Union's prosperity, productivity, competitiveness and growth, as well as the well-being of consumers in today's globalized markets. It is important to ensure that our legislation in the EU is fit for new technologies coming for the digital era, reaping the benefits and addressing the challenges of technical progress, while ensuring the trust of consumers and a level playing field for businesses. This is crucial for the internal market. I want to express the hope, therefore, that the Commissioner-designate will understand the IMCO concerns for the future developments of the internal market and for the need to focus on its proper functioning to deliver concrete benefits to businesses, consumers and employees. Having said this, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mrs. Valian from the ITRE committee, please.
Thank you very much, Madam de Soutter. Welcome, everyone, members of both ITRE and IMCO committees to this hearing. A special welcome to Madame Goulard, our Commissioner-designate for the portfolio which would be in the remit of our two committees. And, of course, welcome to everyone else who is watching us from this room or from online, since the meeting is web-streamed. Let me recall you that ITRE committee is responsible, among other things, for a huge part of the portfolio indicated for Madame Goulard. We care for industrial policy, new technologies, SMEs, space, the information society, information technology and communication networks and services. This hearing, though, it's very important for the members of ITRE committee because we see in this portfolio the true future of industrial policy in Europe, its competitiveness and its future development for new technologies. So we are very keen to hear from you, Madame Goulard, today. What are your views in this respect? Please, everyone, allow me to remind you how these hearings are going to be held. We will start with a statement of up to 15 minutes made by Madame Goulard. Then we will have a first round of questions from representatives of the political groups. And after that, so we have 7, so then after that another 18 questions, which are distributed among political groups based on the DONT system. In the end, Madame Goulard will have again the possibility to make a statement up to 5 minutes. Now, regarding the questions you can raise in this hearing, the structure of a question is like that. It's 1 minute for asking the question, up to 2 minutes for Madame Goulard to give an answer, and then there is the possibility of a follow-up question up to 1 minute, and for an answer up to 1 minute. So we'll have a 5 minute per question, with 1 for the question, 2 for the answers, 1 for follow-up, and 1 for the follow-up, the answer to the follow-up question. As a rule, the follow-up question should be on the same topic as the initial question, so please don't diverge too much. I will say that. Our job here, me and Madame de Sutter, is to keep the time very strictly, so please try to be very efficient in asking the question or giving the answer, so that we don't need to use our tools here, like the micro and the hammer, to interrupt you. So this being said, we start the first round of our hearing with the 15 minutes introduction by Madame Goulard. You have the floor.
Mesdames les présidentes, Mesdames et Messieurs les députés, et
chairs, members, and those people who are listening from outside, thanks to new technologies. Well, I'm very moved and happy to be here because I've got very many memories from this room, and I see many very familiar faces here. Now, my ambition for the coming 5 years is to ensure that young Europeans can live pursuant to their choices, so that they can be independent. We need to preserve our freedoms, our prosperity, our social model, and that depends on our being able to ensure that we successfully tackle the digital and environmental transitions. They are the 2 main priorities identified by President von der Leyen. It's an ambitious roadmap, I'm aware of that, and I come here very humbly to deal with very complex issues that some of you know more about than I do. But it's going to be a team mission. It's going to be a mission for the whole Commission, and I'd like to thank them for the work that the help they've given me so far. In my sector, there are 5 main requirements. The first was recalled just now by the chairman, which is to better exploit the potential of the single market. Now, I know what you're going to say to me. You're going to say, well, we know that. We've heard that before. We need to complete the single market. But that is the sine qua non to ensure productivity and jobs. And I think it's encouraging that during the Brexit negotiations, we've managed to remain united in the defence of the single market and what we've built together. Last spring, the European Council urged the Commission and Parliament to make progress on this, and I take that signal received from heads of state and government very seriously. So I look forward to hopefully working with you to releasing our economies, because I think that there's nothing that can shelter us from geopolitical uncertainties. Now, there are various expectations which are legitimate. Some people want more rules, some people want fewer. Some people want more rules to have more security, food safety, cyber security, etc. But other people want fewer rules so that businesses can work better. We're going to have to resume discussions on services because trade in services remains too limited. And also in industry and agriculture, we see that the gap, the difference between services and goods is starting to be blurred. I think we need to be brave enough to respond to issues such as the lack of fiscal equality. And I think that's what President von der Leyen mentioned when she wanted to reconcile the social and market issues. We need a fair minimum wage. I was a shadow rapporteur on a file relating to taxation on businesses, and then we need taxation for large multinationals. We also need to look at the rights of workers on platforms. And I think if we do that, progress can be possible. I'm also going to work on impartially ensuring that the current rules are implemented by rigorously looking at infractions under the control of the Court of Justice. The Speaker kindly thanks the interpreters. So we're working with the Court of Justice, and those who know the work that I've done in the Econ Committee on the Stability and Growth Pact can know that we will try to apply the rules as well as possible with the tools we have available. The second thing is SMEs. With them, if I gain your trust, I want to be as pragmatic as possible. When we meet business leaders on the ground, they're not looking for strategies, they're looking for affordable financing, qualified workers, less red tape, and the possibility of getting paid the money they're owed. And I will be working for their benefit. We have the Invest EU fund, for example, but we also have Solvit, which provides a daily service, and that needs to be fostered. We need to foster SME participation in the Defence Fund. That is one of the tasks that I have been given. And the goal there is to facilitate cooperation between SMEs and large groups and give them access to cooperation, cross-border cooperation, so that they can get hold of some of the 10 billion that are invested on an annual basis in this field. That will enable member states to better use the money that they invest on security. It means that taxpayers will have to pay less, and it will mean more interoperability. This will boost the capacities of member states and will also help NATO capabilities for those who are members. There are also links between civil and military industries. For example, some discoveries in the military field can help in the transport sector. There are also links between defence and space industries, and also when it comes to investments in transport in general and those that aim to foster military mobility. Third point relates to a military strategy for industry. Our industry, however, will have to change profoundly. The circular economy, that's a phrase that seems a bit abstract, but it relates to the waste of plastics, the amounts of wrappers that we see around everything, food waste, and the idea is not only to deal with waste, but also to ensure that we have greener means of production and mean that we can save resources, rare earths, other materials, and also to preserve biodiversity. Once again, I humbly say that I'm aware that the goals that we've set ourselves to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and to move towards zero pollution are extremely ambitious. It's not because that's part of my portfolio, it's because the planet's resources are being exhausted and the young generations are taking to the streets. So we're going to have to achieve this, but to do that we're going to have to innovate more, and we're going to have to catch up our delay in certain technologies, green autonomous cars, hydrogen connected objects, health, microelectronics, batteries. These are tangible issues. Mobility, medical diagnoses, the way that we produce energy. And the idea is to look at the value chain and see how we can put all industries in one sector together and make them work to a single goal. If we don't do that, we'll be dependent on the rest of the world. We will be stuck in some kind of technological servitude, and that won't do. For me, the best form of protection is excellence. We need to invest together. We need to have the best people working here in Europe. We don't want to see the best young people leaving Europe. We've done that for space programs, Galileo, Copernicus, EGNOS. We've done it for supercomputers, and we need to continue to do that in other areas. Then we have projects of a common European interest. These were designed hand in hand with business. This stuff isn't being decided just in an office in Brussels. It's also a way of boosting the single market. Let me now speak English.
The fourth requirement, the external element of the single market must be also reinforced. In order to protect themselves, some advocate abandoning openness. This is not the solution. Europe has been shaped by the movement of people, goods and ideas. Closure cannot be a benefit, neither between us nor vis-à-vis the outside world. On the other hand, we must work hard to make global exchanges fairer. This is the essential difference between protection and protectionism. In order to be open but not powerless, we need to strengthen our tool to fight against unfair competition. I know that Phil Hogan told you recently what he had in mind on that, demanding reciprocity in access to public procurements, monitoring better foreign investment, notably when they target our technology, through the use of trade defence instruments. Furthermore, concerning the technologies of the future, such as artificial intelligence or 5G, for example, the European Union can set the global rules. We did it for the European Data Protection Regulation, strongly supported in the European Parliament. This is exactly what we should try to do again. Et maintenant, je vais passer à l'allemand. Schließlich die fünfte Priorität.
Moving on to the fifth priority, the better protection of Europeans via these changes. Progress in services can only be made in line with our values, and together with Margrethe Vestager, during the first 100 days of our mandate, we will be dealing with issues that relate to artificial intelligence. We are going to ensure that a new law on digital services comes out, which the idea being to renew the 20-year-old one we currently have. We're going to be looking at platforms, protecting users and non-discrimination of minorities, and we also have to ensure protection of children. We need to defend our freedom, firstly, press freedom and artistic freedom. The issue of how we deal with false information is crucial. We need an appropriate balance between freedom and security, and that's not easy to achieve. I'm going to take time together with you, if you confirm me, so that we can work together and look at the issues and understand them before we move on to the next phase. Cybersecurity is going to become more and more important, and we have to work on that and establish a cyber unit. The more digitalization takes place, the more education becomes important, particularly for young people. We need to ensure that there is access to the internet, and we need to guarantee appropriate internet speeds. We need to ensure that people are appropriately trained, particularly women. There are far too few women involved in the digital world. The idea is to support national strategies in this area. When I was active in this Parliament, I had an opportunity to be involved in the intergroup on fighting poverty. We organised meetings with people who personally had suffered poverty. If you support me as Commissioner, I will continue to work with all levels of society, and first and foremost with those who are described as those who have been left behind. I will be looking to develop a dynamic and solidarity-based sector, and I hope that in 5 years' time we will be able to measure our success by saying that we have cared for the weakest in society so that they have been able to be involved in the changes that we've held.
This Europe, which is sovereign, competitive and underpinned by solidarity, is something I've been devoted to all my life. My European commitment is deep and far-reaching. My parents have passed away, but I'd like to thank my family for their help. And I thank my parents for the education I received, and that is why I feel profoundly French and European. There is no contradiction there. For 30 years now, I've worked on European affairs in the French Diplomacy Service and the European Commission under Romano Prodi, who I pay tribute to for the enlargement work there. In the European Parliament, in the Euro systems, I've carried out research, I've written several books, and also guided citizens' movements at the head of the European movement in France for 4 years, for instance, and in different international circles as well. My activity for the Berggruen Institute, which has actually raised some question marks, is also enshrined in that journey. It has helped me carry out reflections for the Council on the Future of Europe, which brings together famous university figureheads and other political leaders who I worked with on issues such as governance or the rise of Euroscepticism. Madam Chairs, ladies and gentlemen, and all of the other people who are listening to us this afternoon, the European Union has gone through a decade of crisis, financial, economic, social crisis, and I had this first-hand experience in the Econ Committee when we dealt with the crisis. We also had the migratory crisis, which has created a gap between the East and West. Then between the North and the South there have been difficulties as well. And this Commission wants to look to the future, look ahead and bring European people together to do things together. We're not asking where they're from, but where they want to go. I'll be working with all of you, with all of my colleagues at the Commission, and with the Committee of the Regions, the Economic and Social Committee, all of the possible resources available across the board, the unions, the businesses, the NGOs, consumer protection organisations. And as a former MEP, Madam Chairs, and as a former coordinator, there are people here from Econ here this afternoon, I am able to understand the importance of close cooperation between the Commission that makes the proposals and the European Parliament, which is the co-legislator. And if you place your confidence in me, I am committed to working closely with you at every single stage of the legislative procedure and on all the initiatives that you would like to bring forward. I will listen to you, and although I don't know the rest of the College will follow me. So I hope this hearing will be the beginning of a strong relationship underpinned by listening to each other and mutual respect. And I'm very happy and looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman and ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Madam Goulard, for your presentation. Now we start the first round of questions, representatives of political groups. So the first one to raise a question is Mr. François-Xavier Bellamy, au nom de PPE.
On behalf of the EPP. Good morning. Industry faces many challenges, as does defence. We need a strong strategy. We also need the trust and confidence to be able to act. As Minister of Defence in France, you decided to resign as relation to legal proceedings in the European Parliament. You said that you need to ensure confidence in public life. The honour of men and women who are working in a ministry should not lead to question. You said that a convicted European, you wanted to raise requirements in many member states. It seems you seem to recognise the actions because you had to repay some significant sums and there's still ongoing proceedings. We're not here to judge, clearly, but with my colleagues here in the EPP, would like to repeat your words to you. How can we say that you resigned from the government in France, and how can you then say that you can act in independence and serenity in the European Commission? Should we not apply the same rules here as in national politics? Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Député.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me this question, because I can actually reply to that. Firstly, the presumption of innocence is a fundamental right. It's in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, in the European Charter of Human Rights, and in the French Constitution. But for those of you who are not French, and I'll say this to you, and hopefully it won't just be between us in France, since the 1990s, there has been a tradition. Any minister who is indicted, they should resign. In June 2017, there was an investigation opened in relation to parliamentary assistants here in the European Parliament. I was not indicted, but I thought that I was responsible. I was responsible for the French army. We had a very difficult situation in France at the time. We had a range of terrorist attacks in France at the time, and we had French forces engaged in Mali to protect France and Europe. I felt that I could not run this risk. I could not jeopardise the French army, the women and men who are prepared to give their lives. Now the situation is fundamentally different. Firstly, I have been heard by French justice and I have not been indicted. Secondly, in European institutions, as far as I am aware, this tradition does not exist, so we can transpose national text to European level, but normally it's European down to national level. I'd like to say just one thing. I'm very committed to integrity. I also took a step back, and I have not been found guilty. I have not been recognised as guilty when the Secretary General began an investigation here in this Parliament, said that my assistant worked here for 5 years. I was asked certain questions. I was asked to reimburse some funds. It's not money that I received myself, but there was problems rated when my assistant resigned. So I would ask you all to look at the situation in detail and also to respect the presumption of innocence. Thank you.
Merci, Madame, pour votre
Thank you, Madam. Presumption of innocence is a vital principle, and I didn't want to undermine that with my question, but I think what you said is important. You said the risk that you were bringing to your ministry, even just being implicated in this affair. When you resigned, you didn't say that you were perhaps indicted, which applies in French politics. You said you wanted to apply to yourself the standards in member states at times with a greater rigour. Now, here we're talking about issues which are vital for the future of Europe, and this responsibility requires a strong strategy to allow Europe to refine its industrial and economic strength. Given that you thought you might be a risk for the French Ministry of Defence, and you thought that the investigation is still ongoing with Olaf, I'm not presuming anything, but how can you think that you would have been a risk for the Ministry of Defence, but you won't be a risk in the position you may take up in the Commission? Mr. Bellamy, I'm very confident, I'm very calm. I can say clearly I have not been indicted. I can't prejudge the investigations. You mentioned Olaf. Olaf is often included via referral, and I respect any decision that comes out of the judiciary. But to you and to all of your colleagues, let me say as follows. You say the jury commission stated that there were no conflicts of interest to allow me to come here to this hearing. That's a new part of this procedure. I feel calm, and it's not that I am holding the European institutions in contempt. I think the importance of people's lives is very different. It's much more serious. There's a lot that is said in the press, but this has been a tradition in France. At the time I took a decision based on my soul and my conscience, and I do the same today before you.
Thank you very much. Now the next speaker is Madame Chaldemus from S&D Group.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Parliament, back to the Parliament, Madame Goulard. And I do have to apologise, but I have to continue on the same road as before, and not so much with the French. But you were sitting in our seat 5 years ago when we had the hearings, and you said about your countryman Moscovici that you thought it was very important that you couldn't question people's personality and behaviour, and you thought that he was questionable. Don't you think yourself are questionable here in this? You have an Olaf case pending and a pending case in France. You have even paid back 45,000 euros. Don't you think that it is worth questioning whether you are questionable, since that was something you emphasized on Moscovici some years ago?
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Merci pour votre question. Je crois.
Thanks very much indeed for the question. First, let me say that I fully respect the work that you are doing. I've done it myself, and it's completely, in line with the objective of this hearing. When we heard Pierre Moscovici, I don't think we should get this into the discussion today, to be honest with you. But the question I asked was a question that was linked to the way in which public finances had been managed without there being any personal issues. So let's not conflate problems here. Now, at the moment, you're busy in a political game, but at the time, we were in a situation where we had the Eurozone crisis, there was a loss of confidence, there were certain member states who were respecting the Growth and Stability Pact and others less so. It was a completely different situation. Now, on the issue of the sums that I had to pay to the European Parliament, and this is your institution, the Secretary-General carried out an in-depth investigation to look into the administrative side of this to see if the local assistant had actually worked or not. And the conclusion was yes, for a period of 5 years. But what had been contested was the fact, and apparently this happens quite regularly to employers, if there are SME owners listening today in France, they perhaps are aware of this. If you are in this case, you might have a salaried worker and then you might bring that contract to a close. You don't want to penalise the person, you don't want to lay them off, but they find it difficult to leave and get a new job, and time then passes. But actually, when you get to the end of the story, you might realise, yes, it went on for quite a long time, but actually it's more about an HR management issue. And if you go back to the Secretary-General of your institution, you'll get the explanation that this is not a legal problem. It was about administrative verifications that had to be carried out. It's an HR management issue which led to a sum of money being paid not to me, Mrs. Scaldemoser, but to another person. And, it might happen that you will one day be involved in a legal proceeding involving dismissal and so on. But, I think it's more to do with the difficulties pertaining to the statute for the assistants that govern them. Thank you.
I don't know if I should have been speaking in Danish, but, if you see Ursula von der Leyen, she has in the mission letter stated that it is very important that there should be no doubt on your behaviour or your integrity. So that's why I asked the question. I think that €45,000 is a lot of money. I've been here for 14 years. I haven't had the necessity to pay back 45,000. So I thought it was worth having questioned this. But don't you think it is important that commissioners of the EU Commission is clean and are people where we cannot question whether they have integrity or not? Don't you think that's important?
Madame Goulard?
I'm clean. J'ai respecté.
I respected the decision of the Secretary-General. I respected the decision of the Secretary-General of this Parliament. And the sum is actually to cover wages and social contributions. That's what it was. That's what the sums were for. We're not going to get into the detail of this now, but I can assure you that if you look into this, you'll see, and I'm actually very happy that employees in Europe are actually contributing to social security financing. That's important, but I followed the decision of the Secretary-General of the European Parliament that applied very strict case law from the European Court of Justice, according to which if you have less than enough evidence for the work of an assistant, then you have to pay the sum due. That's the situation. Those are the facts, and you can, of course, go and ask the Secretary-General as MEPs. This is not a penalty or a sanction. It's not a sanction as a decision.
Next speaker is Madam Dita Charanzova from Renew.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear Sylvie, as many here, I know you, I know your hard work and your engagement in the European project. And I'm confident and I know that you have the skills to do the job and do it well. But what I would like to hear from you today is whether you have the courage to stand up for the internal market and all 4 freedoms of the internal market. In your mission letter, you have the Digital Service Act as one of your major tasks. One person told me a few days ago that the digital services are above all only services. This person was you. And I agree with you, and I would add that without services, the internal market will never be completed. The 2 greatest voices we had for the single market were Mr. Bolkestein and Mr. Barnier. Both had the courage to stand up and battle vested interests both at home and at the EU level. So my question is, will you have the same courage to carry on this work, and will you be able to open the service directive and extend it further? Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Merci, Madame la députée.
Thank you very much, colleague. Thank you for having recalled my work. I think that all those who are in this Parliament will know that I've carried out a series of battles, gender equality, banking, stability, but I think we should be aware that it's not only the courage of the Commissioner that counts. That's not what you wanted to say. It's a collective game. The college needs to work, member states need to get involved, the industry, services, agriculture, everyone needs to be firmly convinced that Europe is a good thing and it's worth making concessions for it. So I fully agree with you on the potential for growth and also jobs, which are linked to improvements on our service rules. But at the same time, in the past perhaps, there were efforts that actually had unintended consequences. Some people perhaps ended up left behind and were left scared, and that's why we need to find a consensus. This is something that we'll be dealing with. It's part of my portfolio, a new Digital Services Act. There's no doubt on that. We'll be dealing with issues relating to the collaborative economy. We'll be looking to carry out more enforcement, perhaps by looking very carefully at the sectors that we're going to focus on rather than opening everything up. And obviously we'll get complaints, but whatever. So I think essentially we'll have to work together and we'll have to change people's views together. Some people want to put Central and Eastern Europe and pit them against Western Europe. We have different traditions. Our values perhaps are slightly different, but we need to talk about these things, and I will do everything I can. You can call it courage, energy, whatever. I'll do everything possible to move that cause forward.
I will come back to the Digital Service Act. There are different ideas how to approach it. We are just at the beginning of this discussion, and I'm sure the Parliament will have a say on it too. But my basic or general question to you will be, do you intend with the Digital Service Act to strengthen the free movement of services in Europe? And can you pledge that you will not create new barriers in Europe? Thank you.
Madame Goulard.
Le marché, je crois que c'est pour ça qu'on l'a bien défendu.
I think that the reason why we've defended the single market throughout the Brexit negotiations is because it's the basis of the four freedoms, and that's why we need to insist on this vis-à-vis our citizens so that they see the benefits. So yes, this relates to freedom, so that people can move around, people can go and work in other countries, people can go and study elsewhere, live in another country, exchange products. This is a freedom. And when it comes to internet freedom, if we don't organise these things ourselves, then we're going to have it organised for us by extremely powerful global groups who have access to consumer data, etc. So we need to respect the freedoms. We need to ensure that innovative startups have more freedoms, because these are often run by young people, and we also need to avoid regulatory fragmentation. I can guarantee to you that we in the Commission are not going to introduce barriers. What we have to do is to persuade national legislators to move in that direction.
Speaker is Marcel Colaya. He is representing the Greens Group.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Commissioner designate, here I am. Despite 250,000 people in Germany only demonstrating and petitions signed by Europeans against the liability of online content service providers and mandatory filtering of copyrighted content, the Commission now plans to further upgrade the general liability rules in the new Digital Services Act. At the same time, your home country, France, is legislating on hate speech law, which is widely criticized by digital rights NGOs in France and Europe. How will you ensure that the new Digital Services Act respects fundamental rights online, and that your national position won't influence your work on similar rules in Europe or impacts the country of origin principle, crucial for European companies to provide cross-border services? In addition to that, while legislators are threatening big tech companies with liability for hate speech and disinformation online. We know that micro-targeting and algorithms are trained to amplify content to make profit. Wouldn't it be more productive to rather focus on advertising and fact-checking to address the core of the problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Goulard.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. It's a particularly sensitive question. The reason for that is a question that touches on people's freedoms. Europe is the only global economy, the only global space that ensures internet neutrality, and this neutrality is not being undermined by the Commission's initiatives. The update ongoing with the European Regulator for Electronic Communications ensures that this principle is maintained. The e-commerce directive and everything linked to the liability was set up 20 years ago. I think you're very active in this sector yourself. 20 years is a long time in this area. So we should ensure that we don't undermine the principle, the idea of liability. But we can still have a discussion. It's a process we can go through together. We need to look at the details and look at what needs to be updated or improved. You mentioned hate speech. I'm not in the European Commission to try and impose French law. That's not what I'm trying to do. I think we all need to look at a real problem, a problem that exists on the internet. There are people who are inciting hate, calling for terrorist attacks, who stigmatize people for their religion, who bring discrimination that can have significant ramifications. So in all issues around public freedom, we need to find this balance, and this balance is a political choice. A political choice in a democracy is the choice of the Parliament. In the European Union, there's two chambers, if you will. There's yourselves and there's the Council, and legislations come from these two chambers. Now, as a rapporteur in this House, I know the Commission proposes a text, but you will amend it, and that will be an interesting point. So I will come before you humbly. I won't come back with a response. There are responses we can build together.
The next speaker is Virginie Joron.
Follow-up.
Oh, it's a follow-up question. I'm sorry. Yeah, Mr. Colaya, follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a follow-up question on the kind of topics that were discussed in the beginning that is important for our group. According to the French press, you were paid while being an MEP over 10,000 euros per month during 27 months between 2013 and 2015 by the US pro-European think tank Berggruen Institute. The Institute wrote a letter to Mrs. von der Leyen to attest that you extensively advised them on European policies, being regularly in touch with their leadership. Now you deem that since it was a non-profit organization,
it's a different question.
There was no conflict of interest at the time with your mandate as MEP. Given that being an MEP is a full-time job, can you explain how did you reconcile these two obligations, and would you take similar commitment as Commissioner? Thank you.
So it's not quite the same, the follow-up. So, Madame Goulard, if you don't want to answer, you might not answer. You want to answer? Okay.
I want to answer. I'm for freedom on internet and also in this room, don't worry. J'ai mentionné moi.
I myself mentioned in my opening remark this work. It was a think tank. This is a pro-European Tank. There's Europeans I was working with. I declared everything. Everything was legal. The Parliament allows, or at least did allow, and I think it's still the case, but it allows external professional activity. Whether you think it's opportune or not, that's a decision that falls on MEPs. But we can't cast aspersions on an individual just for having worked with someone. But what was I doing? I was trying to promote European integration. I met the Berggruen Institute in a meeting in May 2013, a meeting in Paris looking at youth employment, and other colleagues from the Econ Committee will remember this, that we were trying to fight to combat youth unemployment and work in this area. I thought it was a good way to try and push the same ambition from different areas.
Now is Madame Virginie Yoron from ID Group.
Merci, Madame. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman. I have to say I'm very surprised to see you here, Madam. You had to stand down from the Macron government because of an investigation into your work as an MEP, and I've got the Olaf letter here which confirms that you're only candidate for a commissioner's post that's currently under investigation. In summary, you're not worthy of a French government, but apparently you are worthy of working as a commissioner in Brussels. So, Madam, how many French people earn €13,000 a month to make phone calls? The Berggruen Institute, an American think tank, not registered at the European Parliament, was paying you €13,000 a month when you were an MEP. Did you write anything more than this 13-page note in exchange for €13,000 per month for 3 years? Yes, you wrote a report, a single one, during your last mandate, which talked about the creation of a World Financial Organization. And this globalist vision is worrying because everything that we love about Europe is just being cast aside. Respect for European identities and national sovereignty. What other services did you render, or would you render, in exchange for more money than an MEP earns per month? And that was about over $30,000 or euros. Thank you.
Madame la députée.
Honourable Member, I've already touched on this question. I'd be happy to answer in the following way. You cannot cast aspersions on people without actually coming forward with evidence. I work for a think tank. In that think tank, we carried out activities touching on reflections, organising groups, organising meetings. It was authorised work, and the people who I work with confirmed that. These are possibly objectives that you don't like, and I understand that. I respect that. That's your right not to agree with my vision of global governance and not to want to participate in these activities. But once again, in 2013, we were in a very acute phase of the crisis, and I think it's very important to be able to bring people together. If you want to help the most disadvantaged or unemployed or poorest people, you're basically saying we shouldn't talk to other people. I disagree. I think it's important to have access to influential people, former heads of state and government in Europe, for example, from different parties. There was Felipe González, Mario Monti, Guy Verhofstadt. They were all there. And then also renowned intellectuals. These were people who could help us bring forward new ideas, in my view. And did I imagine that this would ever cause this many problems? No. It's true that the money, the amounts were quite high, but they're nevertheless sums that correspond to the kind of sums that are paid for this kind of international work. And if you look at the experience that I had chaired important international organizations carrying out important work. I can work in 4 languages. And people felt that that was work that could be paid for. So once again, I think the presumption of innocence is absolutely vital. Thank you.
Oui, merci. Madame.
Yes, well, the United Nations is not an issue here. You're actually contributing to an American company here, and that's a kind of interference that was going on when you were an MEP. And when you were an MEP, you were involved with this lobby that shouldn't be involved in European affairs. This is an embarrassing situation. You know this. We can smell the panic. And this morning, at the last minute, we received a support letter from that lobby with your application. And there are a number of issues with regard to financial questions as well. And it's also curious that the Legal Affairs Committee refused to verify the services that have been rendered to this think tank. Why? And then the boss of the think tank also had financed the Macron campaign. And this is strange for people who in 2014 were saying that only people above reproach could be accepted as commissioner. So on behalf of all of the Europeans who don't think there isn't a roadmap to be achieved in California, I have to say that I won't be supporting you in your ephemeral ambition to become the Commissioner designate. Thank you.
Madame la députée.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I wasn't really expecting your support, to be honest with you, but let's get to the substance of this, because you made a very important point with regard to the United States. This wasn't the Pentagon. This wasn't the US government. You know, there's civil society. There are people out there who we can speak to. Let's, make a difference between an official representative and private individuals. Nicolas Berggren, by the way, is also German. Maybe you don't like that, but he is. He's a European. He grew up in Paris, and now he's living in the United States. Secondly, transatlantic relations are important. That's a reality for all of the things that we're concerned with here. So having worked with Americans in respect of their independence and mine, I don't really see that that's a problem that I should be accused of having made a mistake for. And also, California is the cradle of many organizations that are extremely important for the future of the world, and I'm actually very pleased I had this experience.
Next speaker is Adam Beelen, representing the ECR group.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Commissioner Designate, public and private research laboratories across the EU and the world are puzzling over the general shape and future development of artificial intelligence. Yet, as Commissioner, you intend to bring forward a robust regulatory framework for this nascent technology within the first 100 days. How many days will you need to tackle the continuing problems with the enforcement of the Services Directive, beyond only digital, which hamper the development of real companies on the ground across the European Union every day? I agree with your written response that, quote, better integrated services markets help the whole of the economy, unquote. Shouldn't your priorities reflect this?
Madame Goulard.
Merci, Monsieur le député.
Thank you. Artificial intelligence is a very wide field, and I'm looking into it very humbly. There are some things that we'll be able to do in the first 100 days. Mrs. von der Leyen is committed to it. Mr. Vestager and myself are very determined, and we'll be able to base ourselves on work that's already been done, i.e. looking at ethics when using these technologies, and we're going to be able to base ourselves on that work that's been done. But as I said earlier, on services or issues relating to internet liability, well, we're going to have to work together. It's a big issue. There are various principles we have in our heads at the moment, but we're going to have to look at what the results of discussions are with the economic sector that deals with these issues. But there is something that's important, and I want to say this for people who are listening from outside. This is not an abstract discussion. These are technologies that can help doctors make more precise diagnoses, as I saw when I was working for the French Banque de France. It's technology that can help us make payments. So these are things that we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of, but they do nevertheless need to be put into a framework, because the use of algorithms on a wide scale may lead to discrimination. It could lead to, for example, all banks refusing to lend you money because your profile doesn't fit the right parameters. So once again, we're going to be working on this. We're going to make some proposals, and they'll obviously come in front of you. But as I say, we're going to have to do all of that without losing sight of traditional industrial sectors, where sectors that are going to have to change, those that perhaps are seen as representing the past to a certain extent. What I want us to do when we look into AI is to see what they can contribute to more traditional sectors.
The previous Internal Market Commissioner found it difficult to bring member states along with her on services initiatives. What will you do differently? The previous Commissioner also found that well-intentioned pro-single market initiatives can get hijacked in the legislative process. If your proposal begin as shields to protect the single market, but are turned into swords to harm the single markets, will you withdraw them before the damage is done?
D'abord, je tiens à rendre hommage.
Well, let me pay tribute to the work of Mrs. Bienkowska. And that's why I said earlier that I didn't think that being a brave commissioner was enough. I think there is this idea of mobilization. We want to get heads of state and government involved. We want them to talk to their ministers responsible for competitiveness as well. We can hope, I think, that what's happening with the United Kingdom may well have shown people, alas, that the internal market is something of value. But first and foremost, I think that we need to stop looking at the things that divide us as being the most important thing at the moment. The most important thing at the moment is the speed at which other countries in the world are investing in technologies, training engineers, and looking to conquer markets, sometimes without respecting the rules of the game. That is our priority, and that's what we need to tackle.
Thank you. And the last speaker of the first round is Madame Konečná, representing the GUE Group.
Děkuji, paní předsedající.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Madam Commissioner Designate, I would like to say that for me, you're a real star, because have enough time to be an MEP and at the same time have a job for 10,000 euros with all that you had to do in your think tank. Well, that takes a lot of courage, I must say that. So I'm convinced that you can do anything. Because just like many of my colleagues, I can't imagine to do 2 full-time jobs when you're just one person. Well, I commend you for that. But now let's get serious. You're going to be in charge of the implementation of the European Defence Fund. And I would like to tell you, can you give us an idea about the process? What will it look like? And which control rights and control mechanisms can you grant to the European Parliament when it comes to the European Defence Fund? And another question is about tourism, because you're also in charge of tourism. It's in the competence of DG GROW. And in no letter from the President-elect and in your answers, I found nothing about tourism, which can be a major problem when I think of the Thomas Cook affair.
Très bien, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, well, at least for noting my energy. The European Defence Fund is a very important issue, and you're right to say that procedure needs to be looked at carefully. The procedure is collective. It brings in the European Commission, decisions from the college, member state expert groups. So we have this bring them in when we identify projects and also later guarantees as well. So this is a collective project, an impartial procedure. And so my influence will be one of the commissioners, but all the other commissioners will have input as well and will decide together. This fund will be important to help a number of SMEs to strengthen Europe as well, because global security at the moment is probably under greater threat than we would have expected a few years ago. That's why I think investing together in this collective approach is what we need to do. There's going to be businesses from 3 member states, and this ensures, if this is your concern, it means that it's not just going to be the so-called large countries receiving all the money. And also they have to take in SMEs as well. Others can participate as well, but the funding will be reserved to European businesses, and I think European taxpayers can be pleased with that, because that's quite a normal principle. So how can you control it? Well, you can invite me to speak before you. If you do confirm me, obviously I think it would be normal that you do invite me to different stages, and when there's a file in the College of Commissioners, or I can come to the Parliament and speak to you about it, and I can commit to doing so if necessary.
Follow up.
A může být tedy ta doplňující otázka na...
Well, I would like to ask tourism as a follow-up question. You didn't speak about tourism, but it's a thing that's shaking the internal market of the European Union right now, and it's shaking the trust of the European citizens that the national corporations and their managers have the same rights as do all the employees in the European Union, because this is something that should be under DG GROW in the time to come.
Madame Goulard.
Excusez-moi, madame.
I apologise. I forgot tourism, and I come from Marseille, the Mediterranean, where tourism is a particularly important issue, so it's not something I neglect. Tourism is about 10% of GDP every year, and we are the leading destination in the world for tourism, and obviously, the Czech Republic also contributes to that, especially given the beauty of a town like Prague. It's a cross-cutting issue. It's relevant for many DGs. It's not just competence of DG GROW. What I can do today is just share a few thoughts. I think the real important point here is sustainability. How can we ensure that beautiful cities, the mountain areas, the beaches, don't become victims of their own success? Sustainability is important. There are also human issues. Tourism creates a lot of jobs, and that's important. There's also use of platforms for transport or for accommodation, which in certain countries have meant that some people have taken this on as a job in certain areas, and it creates problems in the neighbourhood. There's also environmental issues. There's protection of cultural heritage as well.
Close the first round of questions. I pass the floor now for chairing to Madame de Soto.
Yes, thank you very much. So we will now open the second round, where members of the various committees can ask their questions. 1 minute for the question, and also 1 minute for the follow-up question. The first is Mr. Arias Echeverria from EPP, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman. Madam Goulard, all of the macroeconomic indicators are warning that there's a new economic recession in the pipeline, which, according to experts, could bring impacts which would be equal to the 2011 crisis. And the internal market, which is the most powerful tool we have to create jobs and wealth, is not going to be able to act properly because of protectionism in certain member states. And our SMEs, self-employed, our companies and our consumers are going to foot the bill for this problem. So this protectionism has been argued for in contradiction to the new trade agreements and other administrative measures. And we look at transport, for example, or the non-respect for the neutrality principle for technology. And implementation and compliance with the current rules are basically very important to create a true European single market. And that includes, obviously, the digital single market. However, for example, the rate of transposition in the member states is at about 8.4 months on average. So can you come up with a plan of action to improve implementation and compliance, and also new instruments to progress the single market and the adoption of other plans to prevent protectionist measures by member states? Thank you.
For your answer, please.
Monsieur le député, merci.
Thank you very much indeed for making the link. No, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. But thank you for making the link between the macroeconomic level indicators, that's the evolution of our economy and the risk of recession, and then what we're doing here in this committee. This is exactly the kind of thinking that we need. We need to be able to explain to people that for us to be more prosperous and grow, and I think that's very much to do with the work of Econ, we have to have companies doing well, we have to have a market that works well, we need to have digitalization making progress, we need greening as well of the economy. So you're quite right to make that link. I don't know what the most recent macroeconomic indicators are. I worked recently at the Bank of France and we followed this closely. I know that there are worrying signs that come from protectionism, but that's global. You talked about the barriers between the member states, and these are obviously hampering our performance, but we're going going to try to do everything to prevent that. But let's not forget that our economy is very much integrated in the world economy, and signals coming from a country like the US, which wasn't in this position in the past, and then the way in which the Chinese are developing, and then the fact that a certain number of countries are taking sort of measures to shrink or close in on themselves. Then you've got, of course, Brexit at the end of this month, although we still don't know what the strategy of the British government is going to be on that front. But for all of these reasons, you're quite right. We have to use all of the potential of the market that we have, and that we go out and explain this. And I'd like to do that together with you. Explain the fact that we do need to make short-term sacrifices sometimes. You make a compromise, you give something to somebody else, because that will then strengthen our hand and our economic and industrial fabric in Europe. Now, in terms of the agreements and work to be done under Phil Hogan, I mentioned that earlier, but we've got to work together, and there are two phases here, internal and external, and I think up until now we've been too busy on the internal front and not focusing enough on the international or external protection of the single market. Thank you very much indeed for that answer. We know that the member states in many cases prefer legislative instruments like directives, which has nothing to do with internal rules. But if you're Commissioner, will you commit to the use of regulations more regularly for harmonising the internal market instead of directives? And then in your written answers, you talked about the fact that you wouldn't hesitate to adopt more strict measures. But if you're going to be Commissioner, how are you going to make the Commission to adopt more effective measures against infringements, even if these are politically controversial? Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Well, on the first question, on regulations or directives, I'm going to give you my personal preference. My personal preference is that we should have few rules, but make sure they're properly applied everywhere. And that then takes us in favour of the regulations, because they're directly applicable in the member states. You don't have to have the transposition period. And you also avoid a number of differences and disparities. I think they're referred to as gold plating, but it's not that fabulously and gold, actually. It's irritating. The directive is true, was invented to deal with subsidiarity, to allow the national legislators or regional legislators to make changes as necessary. So we have to be pragmatic in our approach here. We can't just say we're only going to issue regulations or directives. We've got to try to use the instrument that is most appropriate for a given situation. But what is clear is that when you take a directive, the member states are committed. They are committed to implementing it. They have to. And perhaps with the national parliaments, and I will try to reach out to the national parliaments if you vote in favour of me, to see how we can better transpose regulation. We have to have more dialogue between the European and national level. And when I worked as an MEP, I did try to engage with the national parliaments. And I think it's very important to make sure that the law is properly applied. That's the most important thing.
Geyer, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mrs. Goulard, let me go back to the issue of your assistant. You presented it as being something that's more related to human resources, but the Olaf investigation continues, and on the day that you were nominated by Mrs. von der Leyen, you were heard from the police in France. I mean, you resigned as defence minister as a result of this matter. So the question is, why do you think you can be a commissioner but not a defence minister?
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Thank you for your question. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough on this. The facts. When I came to the Parliament in 2009, I employed the assistance of my predecessor from the constituency. I didn't have any political experience. I came from civil society. I was president of the European movement. So I employed this person. They worked for me for 5 years during the entire parliamentary term. And it's the Secretary General of the Parliament who saw that, after looking at many documents that I provided. And the conclusion from that investigation was that there was no fraud there. And at the end of the first parliamentary term, I decided not to maintain a local assistant. I decided not to have that person because I thought that the organisation of my office was unbalanced. So I didn't have a local assistant during my second parliamentary term. So we decided to separate through an amicable procedure. And as I explained earlier, this lasted a bit longer than envisaged. Also because French labour law, quite rightly, protects employees. And I didn't want to get involved in a dismissal procedure as well. So I decided not to remain a member of the French government. And the reason for that, as I explained earlier to Mr. Bellamy, relates to this tradition that exists in France but doesn't exist at the European level. But let me highlight one point. I respect the independence of the judiciary. I mean, I would far prefer having this issue done and dusted. I'd like to have all of this behind me, but I respect the independence of the judiciary. The investigation continues after over 2 years, and that's the situation. And it's the same thing for Olaf, and I think that both of them are linked. So I'm someone who is undergoing legal proceedings. I respect what's going on, and I also respect the opinion of the Legal Affairs Committee that considered that I was fit to appear at my hearing.
Ja, das passt dann sehr gut.
Well, yes. You respect the judiciary in France. And my second question, therefore, is if you are indicted, will you resign as a commissioner?
Merci. Monsieur Gaillard.
Thank you. Mr. Gaillard, I'm not going to respond to hypothetical questions because I can't tell you what the decision will be in France. If I am convicted, that would be different. But today, let's not forget that the Parliament where I worked has looked into this issue. That was where the assistant worked as well. So I hope from the bottom of my heart that I will be able to work with you during a 5-year period if you vote in my favour. Because if we didn't do that, if we went back on the presumption of innocence, that would mean that everyone who was subject to any legal proceedings would no longer be able to do anything. The presumption of innocence is that the consequences are drawn when someone is convicted. And if I'm convicted, obviously I will draw the appropriate conclusions. But that is a hypothetical question at the moment.
Mr. Flego on behalf of Renew.
Thank you very much, Madam Goulard. I am very happy to be able to address you as the reporter for the EP for the new Digital Europe program. I hope that together we will be able to establish a new basis for Digital Europe. I know that the European Commission has proposed, with reference to the 5 priorities, to spend a sum of 9.2 billion euros. This has also been accepted by the Parliament. However, we also know that the Council is prone to cut the budget. So how can we make sure that together with the Member States we are successful in digitalizing our economy and our society if these cuts take place? That's why I want to ask you, will you, as the future Commissioner, stand up for this very important program, Digital Europe, and make sure that it has enough resources in the VFO for 2021-2027 to ensure implementation in full?
Thank you, Mr. Flego.
Oui, non, j'attendais. Je suis désolée.
Sorry, I was just waiting for the end of the interpretation. I didn't want to miss the end of the question. Well, it's a very important question that you ask, and you direct it really onto one of the Commission's priorities, and there's absolutely no doubt we shall fight to defend a budget in this area, this 0.2 billion over 7 years, as you mentioned. If we compare that, how much some of our global competitors are investing in this area, then it's not actually that high. So I will strain every sinew to ensure that we have the largest possible budget in the next multi-annual financial framework. Obviously, that doesn't only depend on me. Obviously, the budget is negotiated by member states, and we're in a budgetary context which isn't necessarily that clear. We don't have the normal leeway, perhaps. So we need to try and ensure that these programmes are convincing in how useful they will be, and then hopefully we can do more with the same amount. Little by little, hopefully we can convince member states that it's worth investing together at a European level. But I need to be honest, I will fight like a lion if I had to, but it's not me myself who will take the final decision about how money is allocated. We need to move beyond this silo thinking as well, because others in the European Parliament are going to be fighting for their priorities as well, and we need to arbitrate. Obviously, I'd like to see increased powers for the European Parliament for budgetary issues. We have a procedure which is unique. We have a Parliament which doesn't have the same competence as a Parliament which can raise taxes and allocate funding, but it's something we need to work with.
Merci. Mr. Flego for follow-up.
Thank you. I have no follow-up question, but I would like to thank you for your positive and specific and very good response. In the forthcoming years, digitalization will be crucial for the success of the European economy and also for our whole society. So we definitely all have to work on this, and it's very important that each part of Europe, north, south, east and west, benefit from this program in the forthcoming period. And last but not least, I hope that all of us in Europe should be in the focus of our efforts, these people who expect benefits from our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flego. Madame Goulard, reaction? No, okay, thank
Merci.
you.
Je sais pas le dire en...
Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Didier from URI Committee on behalf of EPP.
Permettez-moi de revenir quelques instants.
Yes, I'd like to come back to your role as the Berggren Institute, and we're not casting aspersions nor contesting the fact that you can have two parallel activities, this question of energy and intelligence. No one here will question your intelligence, which is not artificial at all. This is obviously taken from your portfolio. But I'd like to understand something here. In terms of the amount is twice what you would have been earning as an MEP. Is it prudent? And it's perhaps a personal question. If you had known that one day you may be a European Commissioner, would you have accepted this income from an American interests, and would you do the same thing again in the future?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Didier. Well, I'm aware of the fact that we're talking about big sums here. Even more so. I said this in German earlier on, actually, but I did actually work to fight against poverty for years as an MEP. And many times I visited people who find it difficult to make ends meet at the end of the months. So I do understand that. However, you know, it's always difficult to compare. So I think you're a lawyer at Bar in New York, in fact, aren't you? Is that not correct? So, as such, you know what level of pay people get in the United States. You know what the fees can be for consultancy. Now, I'm really not casting any aspersions. I'm not judging your professional, personal life. But I just want people to be aware of this. And once again, I really hope... How can I put this? I hope that if you want to cover the whole spectrum of society, the idea of inclusion, then this is something that has to contribute to this dialogue, this discussion between all kinds of different people. I had access to people at top level in Europe through this institute that I wouldn't have had otherwise, because actually the structure within which I was working was mostly made up of Europeans. And there's one thing that I don't regret, and that is that I got such a lot of impetus from working with these people. I was so excited by what I was doing. I felt passionate, and I hope you'll experience this one day as well. People make ideas or proposals, and you go for it, and that's exciting. But what I do regret is the way in which this is being perceived today. I regret the fact that in the light of the debate here, I'm not criticising you, you're doing your job, but we're spending an awful lot of time on this. So I do see now that this issue could have offended people, is offending people, and I'm sorry about that because it's really not the way I wanted to proceed. So I try to get things done. I don't regret that. They have influence, they have talent, these people. I thought to myself afterwards, though, that perhaps, yes, I should have tried to put it together in a different way. In terms of the combination. But to be honest with you, at the time, I also saw what it was all about, what it represented, even though there was the remuneration as well. Let me also just draw your attention to one thing here. This was all declared. And if something is declared and legal, why are we talking about it several years after the event? You know, maybe there's something, a check should have been done beforehand.
Follow up, Monsieur Didier.
Merci.
Thank you. I just want to be specific. There's a difference between your professional life and mine. Different to you. When I became an MEP, I decided to give up all professional activity linked to American interests and to stop my activity as a lawyer as a part of the New York bar. That's a difference. People can judge that for themselves. But put to one side, can you guarantee us that as your activity, as part of your activity at the Berggren Institute, can you say that you've never used confidential information which you received as a European parliamentarian or information from European institutions?
Well, yes, I can guarantee that. First of all, because I think we should come back and revisit what an MEP's work is about. It's not an executive role where you're taking decisions and you have access to financial confidential information. Here, it's transparent. All the amendments are transparent. We work in groups with other MEPs. I've had the opportunity to work with you, with Elisa Ferreira, for example, who's also a commissioner designate, and maybe become my colleague. And I remember on many occasions when there were tricky issues, we talked to each other about them. Nobody had access to information in particular. You know, if you table an amendment, you're one person, you have one voice, but there's a whole process in terms of lawmaking that is an entirely collective one. I don't have access to secret information as an MEP. I didn't have, as a rapporteur, special information at my fingertips. So no, I can tell you that no, this didn't give rise to these kinds of problems, and I could tell you as well that I wouldn't have done what I did if I had had an executive role.
Here is Mrs. Gebhardt on behalf of SD.
Thank you, Mrs. Goulard. Quite honestly, I can't understand why you couldn't be a minister in your country, having been a bit dubious about taxpayers' money here. So you couldn't be defence minister, but you can stand as commissioner. That's just a comment, it's not the question. Now, you have said that discussions on services need to be reopened. But after a long discussion in the European Parliament and with the Council, we have come to a consensus on services. So we found that consensus, which was the target country principle. So that means, does that mean that you want to delete that consensus, go back on it? You want to reintroduce unfair competition between member states? How should I interpret what you said on services?
Madame Goulard.
Well, Mrs. Gebhardt, let me repeat that I am not in the same situation as I was in June 2017. They're not the same functions. There's not this element of committing forces if you're commissioner. I respect the need for continuity in the commission, but back then, the only thing that I can say to you, honestly, is that I couldn't say that I would leave people who are on the ground to protect us in the lurch from one day to the next. That was a personal view. You may see things differently, but I can only tell you how things happened. Now, the second element of difference is that now the procedure has moved forward. I've been able to explain my situation, and once again, without extrapolating too much, because the justice system is the justice system, I have not been indicted after having been heard from. So you may consider these differences in the situation insufficient. That's up to you to decide. But it's important to recall that, nevertheless. The second thing is that, well, what is the goal on services? The goal is not to liberalise everything. That's why I said earlier that liberalisation is not an objective in itself. The goal is to ensure that we can have a social market economy, reconciling the economic matters and social matters. So we need to ensure that there are as many services as possible that can be provided cross-border. But at the same time, we need to protect workers as much as possible. In the past, you have made contributions to this legislation and you've managed to find a balance. But now new services have been developed, and as was so correctly said by Mr. Arias Echeverria, we're in a situation where there are threats to our situation, and so we have to really unleash the potential for job creation at any price. And actually, I'm very surprised by the questions that I've had, because I was expecting questions on the introduction of the minimum wage. I was expecting questions on the fight against poverty. All of that is in Mrs. von der Leyen's programme as well, Mrs. Gebhardt.
Mrs. Gebhardt, for follow-up, please.
Mindestlohn und solche Fragen sind in einem ganz anderen Ausschuss, nämlich dem.
Well, it would be up to the Employment Committee to be asking those questions, so I'm sure you'll get those questions at some point. But it's still not clear to me how you want to reopen discussions on services. I mean, let's be tangible here. Are you going to be proposing a regulation or a directive which looks at social rights in the collaborative platform economy? Is there going to be genuine security for these people? Is that going to be the issue that you look at? Are you going to deal with that issue, yes or no? Good.
Okay.
Kurz und bündig, ja.
Yes. Just to be clear, we have to ensure that we not control but regulate these new aspects of our economy. We really need to know what's going on there, and that we ensure that workers in that field are protected. Protection is important. On the modalities and possibilities, I can't really say a great deal now. That'd be very arrogant. I'd have to talk to my department and other people. But if you do give me your trust, then we will discuss this further.
Thank you. Next speaker on behalf of the Greens, Mr. Bloss.
Ja, auch ein wichtiges Thema.
Well, another important issue for citizens is the Dieselgate scandal. There are still around 50 million dirty diesel cars on Europe's roads. Many people are being subjected to fumes, and this is a massive risk for air quality and people's risk. And until this point, the Commission has had no remit to get these vehicles recalled or to ensure that consumers get damages. The reform of the type approval procedure means that the Commission will have this remit. So how are you going to use your competences to implement that reform? And will you be taking EU-wide measures on the issue? And then another question. Some member states have announced that they're going to be only approving emissions-free vehicles, for example, in France by 2050. How are you going to support these ambitious member states in what they're doing?
Madame Goulard.
D'abord, merci pour cette question.
Firstly, thank you for that question. It's a very important issue as a result of pollution and the impacts on health. In that affair, there's also a situation where the customers have been cheated. Commission firstly tried to improve the rules to test vehicles or the testing of the vehicles. Then there's a reform of the type testing. I will use everything available to me. I can't say exactly how I'll do that today because we also need to look at things with member states. For time being, certain member states are reticent. We need to be clear about that. We need to look at how we can get to a situation where, in reality, things are transparent. I can't. It's not going to be me in my office in Brussels which is going to be able to make major changes there. I think something that can help us will be pressure of public opinion, pressure from yourselves as parliamentarians, the pressure that you can bring to bear at a national level. We know that something that that is seen in certain countries. We need to ensure that industrialists aren't allowed to cheat, aren't allowed to have this organised cheating. But specifically in how we're going to do it, we need to look at that. And the sanctions may be necessary if we can achieve something by persuasion, then I think that's better. I think things can move quicker. If not, we have to go via the Court of Justice, and that can be very time-consuming. But if necessary, we'll use all of the tools available to us.
Mr. Bloss for follow-up.
There is a new rule being discussed on the ADE conformity factors, and that means that manufacturers cannot go over the nitrous oxide standards. The Court of Justice said that this was not in line with the law and called all these potential changes into question. So the question to you, do you commit to withdrawing this proposal from your predecessor, and will you ensure that in the future these kinds of things don't happen in EU legislation? And then the second question I asked you, on EU internal market legislation, how you're going to ensure that France can only approve emissions-free cars by 2050, for example. I mean, how are you going to support France and other member states who are trying to do that and ensure that it's in line with internal market rules?
Yeah, Madame Goulard.
Merci. Sur l'application du...
Firstly, on enforcement, I think it's very important for the Commission to use all of the tools they have available to them, and no doubts about that. That needs to apply to all member states as well. Now, if you think in certain member states have more advanced legislation, we need to look at that. For the time being, I don't have a full overview all the different legislation in this area, and even at France, it's not something I've dealt with yet. However, when you say, do you think, can we envisage withdrawing a text? If it's necessary, the Commission has the power to do so, but we need to balance the pro and the benefits and the disadvantages of that. Before we withdraw a text, we need to see if it can be passed, if we can amend it perhaps. Now, in those procedures that I've been involved in, at times you see the Commission text changing significantly as it goes through the legislative process. It doesn't need to be withdrawn because it's been changed. So I'll be pragmatic. I'll look at all the tools we have, and then I'll look at the file in greater depth when we get there.
Idée.
Merci. Madame Goulard.
Thank you. The Jury Commission, which looks at a conflict of interest, has validated your candidacy, but I just want to say what the conditions were for that. Commissioners designate been rejected. The Romanian and Hungarian commissioners were heard because of the certain doubts around those issues, even though Gilles Le Breton asked for that. And I'm sure it's a pure coincidence that the jury committee is chaired by a Renew member. You said yourselves you received payment from the Berggruen Institute, apparently a philanthropic institute, but they have their interest. The billionaires who fund those think tanks have a vast range of activities in the economic sector. We received a letter from them this morning, so I think they supported you. The activities from the billionaires that finance this institute, what are they?
Merci, Monsieur le Député.
Thank you very much indeed. On the decision of the jury committee, well, I won't judge that. It's not up to me. It's internal to the European Parliament. This procedure was recently created, so if there are anomalies or problems, issues that were not justified, then it's up to the members to deal with that. I won't get into that now. You said I was an employee earning a wage at the Berggruen Institute. There is a difference, actually. There is a difference in terms of my rank. I was a consultant. And for the rest, I really don't know anything about the gainful activities of Mr. Berggruen. I don't know what he's involved with. I was only interested in working with the independent think tank, the Institute. But there is actually one interesting detail in terms of his family, because, and you're quite within your rights to do this, you have, after all, been a minister, so you understand the way things work, and I respect that, but you're basically basing yourself on the principle that this institute couldn't possibly work in a philanthropic way, that they had something to hide. That's your assumption, but my feeling is quite different. My feeling is that Nicolas Berggruen is the son of Heinz Berggruen, a German, who was a victim of Nazi persecution and who fled Germany. And his father lived 20th century European history firsthand. And I'm thinking here of other people like Madeleine Albright, who recently wrote a fantastic book. These people are deeply concerned about what is happening in Europe. They're concerned, they're worried, and, they have resources and they develop ideas according to their own convictions. And I understand that you might not share those views, but I think it's important to let people act, not just because of dark ulterior motives, but because they believe in things, because it's their family history, it's their narrative. Nicolas Berggruen grew up in France. He comes from a family that was a victim of Nazism, and now he wants international governments to function better. And I think that's something that isn't necessarily to be lambasted. I think is something that's important to say vis-à-vis transparency as well.
Madame Goulard, je ne vilipende.
Madam Goulard, I'm not lambasting anyone. I'm just saying it with just you can see on the internet quite quickly. Nicolas Berggruen sponsors the Berggruen Institute in China, looking at artificial intelligence. And according to Business Insider, he's funding huge amounts in California to maintain businesses in artificial intelligence. He's just invested 25 million in Beijing University, a clear competitor on this area for the single market. It recently bought TSC, a transport company in the USA. So I'm sure he has his convictions, but he also has his interests. And the question I ask, you are a consultant, so you have very close links. Does that not have an influence on the portfolio you have today? You are the guardian of European interest in this area, and they're perfectly in line with the interests of this individual.
This is an important question. You're quite right. And those people who know me in this Parliament know that I'm not an impressionable person. But that is a subjective view that people might differ on. But let me come back to what I said earlier on, Mr. Mariani. You might think that the best way to defend yourself against intellectual competition of the US or the Chinese is to have absolutely nothing to do with people from these sectors or these countries. But personally, my feeling is that we should do the contrary, reach out. And when it comes to digital issues, when it comes to economic development, the Asia-Pacific zone is a very important area. And I can guarantee you that if you put your trust in me collectively as the Parliament, I will adhere strictly to the treaties which invite us as commissioners to act with total independence vis-à-vis private interests and other states. But I think that you too have many contacts, and I don't think we should be demonizing certain contacts over others.
The next speaker is Mr. Krasnodemsky from ITRE.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner Designate. My question will concern the European Defence Fund. You expressed your commitment to ensure adequate participation in this fund of SMEs and also other companies that never have worked in the defence sector so far. I would like to ask you, nevertheless, what concrete steps you intend to take in order to make the widening cross-border cooperation between legal entities possible. How to ensure that the main beneficiaries of EDF are not just a few, the largest international defence companies that have been involved in international cooperation for years. So what is concrete, what you see in order to ensure that it will be really a change in the defence industrial policy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Madame Goulard.
Le fonds a justement pour objet. Le fonds a justement.
Well, the goal of the fund is to produce change because it'll be the first time, and I'm talking about the fund as it was designed, negotiated by yourselves, came from Mrs. Biengowska, so that makes me freer to defend it. Well, this fund aims to foster and encourage international cooperation, and the conditions imposed for it to provide credit are conditions that will by definition require cooperation, because there'll have to be at least 3 businesses from 3 different countries for a project to be approved. At least 3, so there may well be more than that. So that will create a certain dynamic that will provide financial carrots for people to work together. It's not going to be something that takes place from one day to the next. There are going to need to be competences there, and there are going to be concerns as to how startups and SMEs are involved. I mean, so that we don't even know how that's going to work. But the main condition, the principal condition, is for several countries to be involved, and the Commission will decide on that collectively. So I don't see why we're going to be trying to favorise some people over others. I mean, apart from the fact that there is a defence industry in some countries and perhaps not in others. But introducing SMEs means that we can shake things up and have the desired effect. There are countries who are big on arms, the Czech Republic, Sweden, and I'm sure they'll be participating. I mean, if your concern relates to large French groups, well, I'm sure that's not going to be an issue. And there are major challenges when it comes to materials, drones, propulsion, engines, etc. I think there's a lot that can be achieved if we really go for this.
Mr. Krasnodemsky for follow-up.
Would you then agree with the Commissioner Bieńkowska's opinion presented in SEDE committee meeting last week, that if, at the end of the day, only 2-3 biggest European defence companies benefited from the fund, it should not be continued after 27?
Thank you. Madame Goulard.
Écoutez, moi, je prends les textes comme ils.
Listen, I take the texts as they are. I mean, if it says 3 in the text, then it's 3.
Okay. So, thank you very much. We'll go to the next speaker, who is Madame Sabine Verheyen, representing the Cult Committee here, and for EPP as well.
Madame Goulard, you will be responsible for an extreme wide portfolio. Today we have learned that you did many things at the same time already in the past. Considering that, can you assure that media and audiovisual policy will receive the priority and focus it requires, given that it is one of the most important, pivotal and multi-faced issues that you will have to deal with? And assuming that is the case, could you outline what will be your main priorities in concrete in that field? Also, given the dual nature of this field, which goes way beyond mere internal market considerations, I would be interested to know how you intend to cooperate with the other commissioners responsible, Maria Gabriel and Vera Jourova, to ensure a consistent and coherent approach to media policy making, and how you will ensure the consistency of the Creative Europe programme in the implementation between the media and the culture parts of this programme.
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Merci, Madame la députée.
Thank you. Well, multitasking, we often say that women are better multitaskers, but I don't want to look at it from that point of view. What I would tend to say is that I'd set priorities, but I don't want to give the idea or the impression that I'm to prefer one topic rather than the other. The portfolio is broad. I didn't draw the portfolio. It's President von der Leyen who gave me or allocated me this portfolio. The things that we can do in a smart manner. Firstly, there's a synergy between everything linked to energy, industry and culture. If we create goods and also maintain an openness in cultural areas, then they can work together. The culture sector is very dynamic here in Europe, in computer games and others, as for example. So we have an economy which is digitalising. We can remain at the forefront of the economy, but in digital economy, I think it's a very important thing to say. These are sectors which I will always keep an eye on, because I always thought culture is part of emancipation of human beings, and I think that's very, very important. I work closely with Madame Gabrielle, someone who's worked fantastically in the area of Connect, and I have a lot to learn from her. And we can have Europe Creative, Horizon Europe, and InvestEU. We can find synergies between these, but that's a roadmap I need to look at with Ms. Gabriel. I think she already had a hearing here. Now, with Ms. Jourova, there's a very important point to make here, and I said it earlier. It's pluralism, independence of the media, fight against disinformation online, and we'll try and work there. And I can't say how that will actually work for the time being between the different vice presidents, but I will commit to working in a team as far as possible.
Leyen, follow-up?
As I asked concretely on the audiovisual media policies, as you know, the revised Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the AVMS, which entered into force last year, currently being transposed by the Member States, was one of our most important legislative acts in the last years for this sector. The directive is based on the liability regime of intermediary service providers and established in the e-commerce directive. This regime, which has proved efficient for the last 2 decades, is the cornerstone of the revised AVMS in regulating video sharing platforms. What is your position on this issue, bearing in mind that the forthcoming revision of the e-commerce directive will start now?
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Well, on that question, I'm not going to undermine the principle set by the legislators on liability. There's no plan to change that. We need to look at certain aspects that can be discussed, and I'm open to discussions. If, after having spoken to the sector, having spoken to yourselves and discuss this in the college, well, do we need to look at any things? Now, as a college of commissioners, we've only met once in Jeanval. We looked at certain issues, certain general issues. We met each other, but I can't look at this obviously on my own. You said yourself, this portfolio links to other ones as well. Now, a directive which was transposed last year, I would tend to say that we need to allow time for implementation. There's a lot of work has already been done. I remember from when I was in that House, the member states now need to transpose this piece of legislation, and hopefully we'll be able to look at this together in the future. But firstly, implementation. Implementation first before changes, then change when they're needed in the future.
Prochaine question, Monsieur Karlskind de Renew.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman. Mrs. Goulard, you touched on your European commitment. It's incomparable, in fact. You spent 8 years in the European Parliament with us here. You were the president of the European movement in France for 4 years. And I also recall that you were the president for the Intergroup for combating poverty. And you touched on this in your introductory remarks, is that the social economy and not just companies are very important when it comes to growth and inclusive growth, and they should be better integrated into the internal market. So the Economic and Social Committee last January adopted specific measures and called for them to be applied to companies, and this includes social integration for people with disabilities on staff. So what kind of measures will you be able to adopt to support these companies acting in the social economy, and how will you change the provisions in the 2014 procurement directive to adapt some of these procurement procedures to be able to include social economy companies as well? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, this is a sector that's very important. In particular, when I was elected, I realised this, because when you go out into the field, the social economy is the economy that offers jobs to people who, for reasons of difficulties they've had in life, or for reasons of remoteness from the big cities, have difficulties getting jobs in the most competitive companies where the bar is set very high. So I think this is a very important social tool, as you said. There's this whole integration aspect, and then there's the idea of trying to improve the bedrock of society, being closer to people at grassroots level and so on. And you really get a sense of this when you go out into the field. So these are 2 million companies. They're important in number. Then you've got the green sector as well, which is absolutely vital for this commission. There are lots of initiatives in the field that have been taken to improve mobility, to reduce the consumption of certain products, to pool resources and so on. So this is very interesting, I think. But I have to say that at this stage, I've looked into this a bit, and here I can see that I'm getting older. But I remember when I was an MEP, particularly in my first mandate, this was a subject that we talked about a lot. And since then, other priorities have come into play, and they could have taken the lead. But it's important to update ourselves on what we can do. You talked about procurement. I think that's important. But public procurement, well, let's not forget there are 2 stakeholders. You've got the person who's contracting, the party who's contracting, and then the other party, if you like. You can't have the Commission forcing companies or local authorities forcing people to choose one bidder over another, but you have to work together with a similar conviction, and you have to agree that we should have, a greener approach, if you like, if I can summarise it like that.
Follow-up?
Well, on that, we know that the legal statutes of these companies vary enormously from one member state to the other. And that means that it's a little bit difficult when it comes to freedom of establishment and so on, and mobility. So would you envisage then the possibility of improving the mobility there and trying to reduce the disparities across the member states in terms of the statute of these companies to improve their free movement?
Si cela a du sens.
Well, yes, if that makes sense, then I'd be happy to look into it. The way I remember it, we're often talking in these cases about companies that are very local in the way they contribute, and they can contribute to cohesion at local level. There might be countries where there's less of a sense of abandonment for some people and so on. I'm not sure if it's 100% relevant right now, but maybe we could think about creating European foundations where you have cross-border donations, which are a possibility. I think Nicolas Baer is leading that work. So you can have foundations able to work in different countries, and they can work in the non-profit sector across the borders. Once again, let me just say, this is something that we're just thinking about now. And as Commissioner, I think it's important to work with the services and offer leadership, and I can assure you that this is going to be one of my important points of leadership and my guidelines. But when it comes to the details with regard to legal structure, financing, statutes and so on the legal side, there will be other programs that will help. Thank you.
Zullo from, non-inscrit. Mr. Zullo.
Grazie.
Thank you, Commissioner Designate. I would like to go back to some of the ideas that you've brought up several times today already, particularly one of the objectives, which is to have a carbon neutral continent by 2050. So ensuring that no greenhouse gases are emitted at all. And also on the basis of the previous mandate, what we discussed in this committee, I think that if we're going to move towards a transition that focuses on the circular economy, first and foremost, we have to ensure the sustainability of and durability of products. Everyone's aware now that cars and domestic objects last less and less long, and we know that this is not sustainable in economic terms, but also in ethical terms. So how do you see this in the context of having longer lifespans for products? What about this inbuilt obsolescence that we see all too often?
Thank you, Mr. Zullo. Madame Goulard.
Onorevole, grazie. Mi fa piacere.
Thank you very much, and it's great to hear some Italian, because there aren't all that many Italians who are going to get the floor today. Well, on sustainability and the lifespan of products, well, there is a genuine ambition here. Once again, I think that this is something that's very important to citizens. We need to demonstrate to them that we're doing something tangible for them when they go shopping, when they buy something. We need to be able to show that in 5 years we've had an influence on their lives and there's less plastic about, etc. So there's no doubt on the priority. But here again, I'd like to remain humble, because this could create an opportunity for large sectors in the economy. It could create jobs, but it's not easy to deal with textiles, food, for example. We need to focus there and do an awful lot more, because we've started looking at these areas, but we haven't yet done a great deal. And then there's this inbuilt obsolescence. The Commission has already launched an independent testing programme on this. It's part of Horizon 2020. And we have to look at that. What do we do when products are no longer sold as well? Can we destroy them? What do we do? And when I was fighting poverty, when I was involved in that task, I went to Italy several times, and I know that there are associations there saying that we shouldn't waste as much food. There's also the issue of consumer information as to how long products should last. That's an area that we need to improve, but there's an awful lot that needs to be done. And I think we need to be humble, because, our goal is to change things. I'm afraid I'll stop speaking Italian there, because it's very difficult to follow my notes written in French and speak Italian. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Goulard. Follow-up, Mr. Zullo?
Sì, grazie, cara Sylvie.
Yes, thank you, dear Sylvie. And I appreciate this effort to tackle waste. So let me just recall one of the results that we achieved in the Parliament when we discussed this issue. And it emerged that promoting sustainability means promoting a new model of society. It means promoting local, specialised jobs that can't be moved away from the local area. It means regenerating the local area. And I think if the Commission, Council and Parliament have this as an objective, they will be able to achieve results in a reasonable period of time. One goal, for example, could be to force people who sell products to offer spare parts for those products at a fair price. So I think there are possibilities here, and I hope that you are going to push that goal forward.
Thank you, Mr. Zullo. Madame Goulard?
Si la volontà c'è.
Well, the will is there. And you're right. We have to force people to move if we have to. But the other thing we have to do is educate people. We can't simply force people. Education and awareness raising and forcing people go hand in hand. We also need to give people time to make that change. You're right. We did discuss and start working on waste. And when we started, we looked at final products, we looked at what we'd consumed and what was being wasted. And you're right, we have to change the entire production chain and design products in a different way so that we can reduce waste. Just as we can't simply complain about the fact that food is wasted if we don't know how to consume things properly.
Merci. Alors, next speaker, Madame Kumpula Natri from SND.
Here. Hello. Madame Goulard, we are counting on your work on the European digitalization, and we need fast connection and 5G throughout Europe to create jobs, prosperity in Europe, and fight climate change. So we need to avoid digital gap in between the areas and among people, and new frontier technologies as AI is crucially needed. I hope you will see a role for regulation in digital economies to secure competition, to avoid digital gap, to secure privacy, and to secure workers and consumers. Not always market alone can do this. I have two questions. Are you unconditionally willing to promote rollout of fast connection on fibre and 5G for everyone and everywhere, and create trust in digitalisation also for consumers and workers? And the second small question on behalf of the Europeans. Will you propose new regulation on roaming and international calls that was regulated last term and will be over in a few years if your answer is no?
Thank you, Mrs. Kumpula Natri. Madame Goulard.
Madame la députée.
Thank you, Madame. On 5G, there's no doubt the Commission has decided, fully committed to try and equip our countries with 5G. It will be very important for our businesses and citizens. This needs to be done in accordance with all the necessary public health rules, and everything needs to be evaluated. But digital divide is still an important issue. If you live in areas that are further out geographically, we feel we're geographically isolated, but the internet service can also lead to a feeling of isolation. 60% of European households in the past few years had a high-speed internet connection, and so that's not enough. It's difficult to roll this out at times, but we do need to achieve this. European approach will be based on the code for investment in this area, obviously taking into account competition rules as well. There will be funding. 3 billion is already made available for Connecting Europe facility to ensure coverage of the key socioeconomic actors, schools, hospitals, etc., and also around the internet interconnectivity corridors, which are very important. I also found out about this initiative about mayors offering free Wi-Fi. There's specific support from the European Union. That's a good initiative as well. Now, on international charges, I think everything that we've done with roaming in Europe has been appreciated as students, hauliers, moving people. So we need to, people really do appreciate it, so we need to look at what can be done. We'll take the necessary measures so that continues, we can all continue with the benefit of roaming. Now, for the time being, I do have to say I'll have to look at the issue in more detail before going back to you with a more specific response.
For follow-up?
Political commitment is, of course, most important at this phase. Dear Commissioner designated, you are proposed to lead 3 DGs, internal market, industry, SME, space, defense, digital. And we really need digitalization to take a good track in Europe, because at the moment we are losing in the most important sectors. If I read a figure of that less than 3% of the applications, devices, equipment, enterprise applications and platform systems are created by Europeans, that will benefit our jobs and our well-being also as a form of taxes and so on. So I ask if you share the worry, and a very concrete, how many days of your week, which is only maybe 7 or 5 days, depends your working hours, are you going to spend on DG Connect? How many on DG Space, and how many in DG Grow?
Madame Goulard.
C'est une question délicate.
Well, this is a sensitive issue. Again, this portfolio may seem huge, but there's obviously 2 DGs and another one that we need to set up. So we've got, there's not 3 DGs yet. Now, what's clear is that you've said it yourselves. With digitisation, we run the risk here in Europe to be left behind by other countries. Digital, obviously, that needs a lot of attention. I can't give you a specific proportion here today. It would just be an abstract answer. What is clear is that I am deeply convinced that digitisation of our economy needs to benefit, industry needs to take into account culture. We need to look at how we combine that with the Green Deal as well. It's inconceivable that businesses become too green and the digitisation is done separately. They go hand in hand. So I can only give you an abstract answer. What is clear is that I've never been afraid of a bit of hard work. I'll be based here in Brussels. I've got some excellent people behind me. If you look at how long people have been working in the Commission in the past few days, well, don't tell the enforcement people because we're going over the directive.
Or to my colleague, Mrs. Valiant, Chair of ITRE.
Not for a question, but...
No.
So we continue with the next round of questions. The first one to speak is Mr. Ivan Stefanek, IMCO EPP. Ivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Commissioner Designate. Here we are. No problem. Madam Commissioner Designate, I do believe that we have to be very strict with regard to the principles of free movement of services, people, goods and capital. And also I recognize that you highlighted the importance of services, which is very good. Because in reality, those principles not always work in the practice. And I can give you just one example that, for example, when a self-employed architect from Luxembourg wants to go to France, it can be done quite easily because it is based on automatic recognition of professional qualification. But if the same person would like to bring somebody from his staff in order to help him, it becomes almost impossible. It becomes mission impossible because prior to his assignment he has to send posting before, and basically there is a lot of numerous compulsory conditions and formalities making this exercise almost impossible. So in reality, free movement doesn't work. My question is how you will address such bureaucratic issues and barriers in order to ensure that the internal market works in practice.
Thank you, Madame Goulard.
Thank you very much indeed for having taken up the example of the professions there, because when you look at the statistics, the infringements I mean, then very often it's about the non-application of the freedom of movement for professionals that comes into question. We have different traditions in the member states, though. That's a good thing, after all. People do want to be reassured that when they hire someone, that somebody is well trained. You talked about an architect. You want them to come from a good firm and so on. So people tend to believe in their own system more than they believe in that of the neighbours. That takes time to overcome. We have to think about the best way to do that. Over the last few years, the European Commission has chosen to systematically apply the directives on professional qualifications, and I think that's a good thing sometimes to focus on a particular sector and then talk about it together. And you're quite right, this freedom of movement has to be real in practice, and this is part of the 4 freedoms, and that has to be respected. So that's a very important issue. We can deal with this through infringement proceedings. You can deal with it looking at dialogue and so on. There are different solutions, but sometimes you get dishonest kind of corporate approaches and people acting out of protectionism. So on the one hand, you've got to be legitimate in terms of protecting people's diplomas, and then you've got to sort of deal with the other side of that as well. Then for the rest, I think you're referring to solutions that exist that are imposed in certain member states. But this is always interesting for me to talk about, although it will also be in the portfolio of Nicolas Schmidt for employment, and he's going to be responsible for this. And I think they're going to have to address these problems in a very practical way to bring solutions forward for all of the people who are wondering about this out there today.
Follow-up question, Mr. Stefanet?
Thank you for the answer, Madame Goulard. But also, I think the point I raised is connected with the basically daily fight against bureaucracy, daily fight in order to remove the barriers. And particularly, I think what is the most problematic area is the area of services. So I would be interested in your approach, how you would like to proceed in area of services, because we need to also go ahead from legislative perspective. So what is your view? Would you like to reopen service directive, for example, or would you like to prefer the way of service notification?
Madame Goulard.
Well, this debate shows me that depending on where the question comes from, it looks very different. I think we have to be careful. As Mrs. Gebhardt said earlier on, we shouldn't be opening up debates which will just fan the flames without reason. But we should actually look at the things that are worthy of revisiting. And I can't just give you my personal opinion on this now, because when you're part of a college of commissioners and you're committed to that, then you have to respect the views of the others as well. So this is principally the responsibility of the Employment Commissioner, but we will look at it together because, of course, it's about the internal market as well. I won't overlook this. We have to find a balance, though. You know how much public opinion can get sort of overheated on these issues. Somebody's pointing the finger one way, and then there are sort of threats being issued and so on. So we have to be very careful, correctly identify what needs to be modified without trying to reduce social rights that people are attached to, and that is something that we have to define together.
Thank you. Next speaker is Manuel Bompard, ITRE GUE.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioner Designate. I'm going to say I do share comments of the ethical issues that your candidacy poses. Now, I'd like to look at industrial policy. That's part of your portfolio. I think today, more than ever, we need industrial policy, especially faced with the ecological transition. Reality is cruel. Europe has lost millions of jobs in the industrial sector over recent years. Many sectors which are vital for the ecological transition are needed. For example, steel production, Alstom and other businesses as well. These businesses which have either been sold or at risk of being sold. Now, in your written responses, you said you are attached to this idea of an industrial strategy. So beyond your statements, what are your real aims for industrial strategy? Do you think we should have a border tax of ecological and social issues? And what about state aid to maintain our independence and strategic assets? And are you happy to put to bed the dogma and ideology of free trade and to fight against the industrial dismantling of Europe?
Monsieur le député,
Yes, there's no doubt on industrial strategy. That will be one of the priorities of this Commission, and if you confirm my position, it will be a priority for me as well. Now, why do I say that? If we want greening and digitisation, that needs to be done within an industrial process. If we want to maintain jobs in Europe, then we need an industry as well. There's jobs elsewhere, in agriculture and services as well, but we have this expertise in Europe. We have a culture, an industrial culture, which should be maintained. How do we do that? Social and environmental tax, President van der Leyen has spoken about that. It's been a taboo subject for a long time, but now it's something we need to look at. We need to look at that in light of the fact that value chains have import and export outside of Europe. The Americans are starting to realise this now. If you put a tax at the border and then you have a value chain which goes over the border, then it has a significant impact. So nothing is taboo, it's not a taboo subject anymore, but we need to look at what is compatible with WTO rules. In the current context, will the WTO continue in its current state of dysfunctionment? I don't know. Well, on state aid now, I think there's a way of doing things which can be useful, and I mentioned this in my answers. We can have certain sectors where we focus public funding if needed and set out sectors, connected cars, hydrogen, e-health, etc., etc. We need to regroup our measures, our means there, and we should work hand in hand with the private sector as well. Now, do we do that by modifying rules on state aid so that we allow public authorities to help any business and under any situation? I think that goes too far. Our businesses are in global competition who can at times receive support from authorities. And this question of dogma, that's religion, I'll put that to one side.
Là, c'est bon. Je vous remercie de
Well, thank you for your reply. Could you be more specific? And we've been hearing this in many commissioner hearings. We've been hearing we'll talk about it in more detail in the future, but now we want to talk about today, not in the future, not tomorrow. Now, obviously, dogma is something that comes from religion, but the question was, are we going to continue in an international environment, and whether it's the US or China, who have very specific industrial strategies, and we, in Europe, we say we're going to do nothing because we have this principle of free trade, and this leading to the environmental disaster and destruction of our industrial fabric. So I'd like to reiterate, we need to ensure that from this point forward we can have an industrial planning strategy for different sectors, for those sectors that we want to grow in Europe, and we protect our expertise, our strategic interests, the interests of our workers, compared to those who at an international level do not have the same attentions to ecological issues. Thank you.
Monsieur le député.
Thank you. I must say I agree with you. The strategy which is adopted for China, I don't want to stigmatise China, but there was a strategy which was adopted in the spring between the High Representatives and the Commission, and that really showed the awareness of these issues that wasn't there a couple of years ago. We have competitors and also and partners as well. They're also the partners in the areas of climate, but they're competitors in other areas, but and they're very powerful competitors who want to be dominant. So we need to be clear about that. Now, I think our role is to find how we do this to European level. We can't be naive about what the Pentagon is providing for American companies or what the Chinese are doing over in China or others elsewhere. But we need to find what works for us. I think we need to remain open, not to disarm our strategy. And I can see your body language now. It doesn't mean that we're going to be open to everything. And so open, but armed.
Thank you very much. Now, Madam Kammerevert, called SND.
Herzlichen Dank.
Well, yes, thank you very much. I want to go back to the question that my colleague, Mrs. Leyen, asked, because I don't think your response was satisfactory. The audiovisual sector really covers many sectors, cinema, video, etc. And I think it really makes a significant economic and social contribution to Europe. There's a cultural dimension, therefore, to your portfolio. Now, in your written answers, you only mention audio-visual media once on page 20, and that only relates to implementing European law and ensuring that member states do the right thing. That's obviously something that we want. But I think, nevertheless, you should have some idea as to which direction we should go in. So when it comes to the Digital Service Act, how are you going to protect or look at the diversity, continue to promote the diversity of media? And how do you think that the media programme that you're responsible for will be used? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much for that question. But I'm grateful that we can go back to this subject, because I don't want to have given the impression that culture is not something I'm interested in itself. And cultural diversity as well. I mean, what is Europe, essentially? Europe is a lot of diversity in a small area, and it's the possibility to have this creation which feeds off various influences in this relatively small area and where we mutually support each other. So, the influence of culture, I would be the last person to deny that. We've got limited space when it comes to answering the questions. As you're aware, there are questions going in all directions, but I didn't absolutely want to give the impression that I'm not interested in that. The audiovisual sector faces the digital transformation like other sectors, but there are specific issues, rights, platforms, the diversity of what's available, remuneration, and there are various complex things that have been established during recent years. But I am going to be defending diversity, certainly. Now, the media programme comes under Creative Europe. I think it is considered a success. It takes over half the budget, and the industries and the various sectors work together. We support many films. When you go to the cinema, I'm always very struck by the list of towns that shows that we fight hard to ensure that culture doesn't only end up in capital cities but also in many towns. There are all sorts of co-productions going on, and that means support, for example, for television series. Films that have been supported by us have had international prizes, and we're certainly not going to be touching those successful programmes. How can we work better now on the Creative Europe and media aspect? Well, it's true that it's cut into two parts at the moment. You've got the DG that will be mine and that which will belong to Maria Gabriel, but we're going to be working together. Her experience will be very precious to me if I become Commissioner, because I know she's worked closely with you on this, so I hope we will be able to move forward.
Yes, follow-up question, Madame Kammerwer.
Ja, vielen herzlichen
Well, yes, thank you very much for the answer. But you didn't really answer my question, because I asked which specific measures and ideas do you have in order to include and foster the audiovisual sector, and also to ensure that we can act as a counterweight to American players who are real heavyweights in this sector. I haven't actually heard any answer, so please, can you be a bit clearer, a bit more tangible? Do you have ideas here? Because you've often said, well, we'll have to discuss that, but perhaps you have an idea as to which direction we should be moving in.
Madame Goulard.
Merci.
Thank you. Let me try and be a bit blunter, perhaps, in what I say. Preserving cultural diversity of small players vis-à-vis large players who come from other parts of the world and who perhaps have greater financial resources. Well, in principle, I fully agree with you. There's no doubt we will be fighting for diversity. But as you say yourself, there's a great deal of competition at the moment. I take the world as it is. I take the situation of Europe as it is. And this is a sector that I haven't had to deal with so far. And so what I don't want to say is that when I turn up, we'll stop American businesses moving into our market. I can't say that. There are various things that we want to achieve, but I don't want to say that I have a solution for all the problems we face. I don't want to seem arrogant in that way.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Sparentak, IMCO and Mrs. Is Mrs. I'm sorry. Mrs. It's IMCO committee, that's why I didn't get to know you yet. So, Mrs. Kim Sparentak.
Thank you. And thank you for your answers so far. I'm here. President-elect von der Leyen has pledged to decarbonize the energy-intensive industries. And enabling industry to become climate neutral by 2050 will be a challenge, but also a great opportunity to ensure EU leadership on circular, climate-friendly and safe products and technologies. To foster this, how do you plan to provide sufficient incentives for greening public procurement within the EU internal market? And do you intend to review the Public Procurement Directive? And do you commit to new measures to further sustainable and fair supply chains through systematic use of environmental, social and fair trade award criteria in public procurement criteria?
Madame Goulard.
Oui, c'est la direction.
Yes, that's the direction that we want to move in. Absolutely. And I think if there is one message that I want to convey today, if you put your trust in me, then that is that this Commission is focusing heavily on greening to make sure that it actually is mainstreamed into the toolboxes that we have. Public procurement accounts for 14% of money spent in Europe, which means we have a lot of leverage there. That means we have to go for this. And then when you're a local elected representative or the person making the choice, then I'm not going to say that the price isn't important. Sometimes people, are scrutinised by their voters and accused of wasting public money because they introduced criteria which weren't wholly focusing on cost. That's how things work, but we are trying to change everything we can in that area, and that's why I talked about the social economy. It's not just about saying we should have greening wrapping around our procedures, no, but everyone in society working in a different way, in a social way or an environmental way, but also in promoting gender equality, in promoting certain behaviours and so on. All of these things are things that we want to introduce and roll out. And if we can do that through public procurement, then that would be good. Environmental criteria and social criteria already exist. A number of decision makers can make use of those criteria. I think we have programs as well which consist in training for people who take these decisions. That could be a useful tool, I think, to slowly spread the idea on this. And I think that's one of the tools that we certainly need to implement as well.
Question?
Taking into account the resource constraints and the need to reduce the environmental footprint of the EU's total production and consumption, what new legislative measures and financing instruments do you propose to strengthen the circular economy in the internal market? And do you commit to setting an EU resource efficiency target, including concrete indicators to be monitored as part of the European semester?
Madame Goulard.
There are funds earmarked in the upcoming MFF on this, and this bothers me. I talked about this with a colleague earlier on, but the tricky thing is we don't know what's going to be in the MFF for the time being. We're going to have to fight for keeping hold of what the Commission has proposed, but we hope there'll be funds earmarked for this. But as the Italian colleague was saying earlier on, there's going to have to be a change in mindset when it comes to the circular economy as well. We'll probably have reached the tipping point when we'll have profitable companies operating and also solidarity or social companies also operating. So people who are able to make a profit out of gaining or achieving these objectives. And that's very important because you're reducing waste, but that means then that the recycling sector might become less profitable than it was when there was more waste, for example. So there has to be a balance. It's complicated. I was talking about this to the Commissioner responsible for who will be responsible for the environment, who's from your political family, who's 28 and is extremely determined, which is a good thing because I think they'll push us, I think, into thinking along young people's lines.
And next one. Next speaker is Madame Dlabayova, ITRE Renew.
Madam Chair, milá paní designovaná komisařka.
Dear Commissioner designate, dear Sylvie, I am very happy that we have this opportunity to meet again in the European Parliament. In your introduction, you have mentioned one of the greatest challenges that the European Union will have to face in the next years. I mean the common European industrial policy, which is something that relates to removing the barriers on the single market. We had many opportunities to discuss this, you and I know that you want to take a pragmatic approach to the industrial strategy. I agree, and I must emphasize that it must be a purely European approach based on European interests, which will not divide Europe into North and South or East and West. From my experience with you in the European Parliament, I know that you can build bridges and find compromises. Can you commit that you will continue to do so in the next 5 years when you work on the industrial policy? How exactly do you want to help European businesses, be they French, German, Czech, or from any other country, so that they can benefit from the single market to the greatest extent and to be competitive outside?
Madame Goulard.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you, dear Martina. Well, I'd normally speak Italian to you, but unfortunately I don't speak Czech either, but I'll stick in French. Now, here before you, I want to say that I understand when MEPs say that I'm not saying exactly what I want to do, but I've always been part of a team. So I have my personal opinions, but when we're part of a team, whether it's a team of rapporteurs or whether I'm working in the European Commission, we need to try and take into account the opinions of others. If we make major statements, then we just find ourselves all alone. It doesn't help when it comes to working in a team. You spoke about the divide between the East and West. I think we need to talk about it. I spoke about Romano. I was with Commissioner Prodi when we had the enlargement, and he defined his commission as the commission of the enlargement. And this was a moment when it was fantastic of Europe coming together. There was a feeling of freedom. There's unification of Germany, which was a fantastic news, the peaceful reunification of Germany. Then we had a lot of good news, peaceful changes in Eastern Europe too. And then a few years later, it seems there were problems in Europe. Those interests of businesses of Europe. we need to move beyond this. It's been said by a lot of people from all political stripes. We are against competitors at global level who have major resources behind them, people who don't want to play by the rules, and so we need to move beyond our differences and I will work in industry, culture, 5G, and there's other as well. Mr. Buzek as well could be transition certain industries. We need to work together, and we'll work with lots of cooperation.
If you wish, no.
The European industrial policy is also related to the innovation and research, and we must be able to turn their results into practice. You mentioned Central and Eastern Europe. I would like to give you an example of GSA, the Global Satellite Navigation System, which is situated in Prague, and it will be transformed into the European Space Programme Agency. Although the competences of this agency will be much larger, this has not been reflected in its budget. How will you make sure that this agency be able to meet its mandate in space policy, which is another great challenge for you? Thank you.
Madame Goulard.
Merci de mentionner l'espace.
Thank you for mentioning space and the agency in Prague. Here is a typical topic where if we invest together, we continue our work, we will maintain a technological advantage. Space is important for big data as well. It's important for access to a range of data. It's something we use with our smartphones every day. Farmers looking at the weather forecast and deciding when to plant their crops. It's extremely important. What can we do in terms of budget? Well, again, that depends on the MFF. I'm sorry to say that once again, but I will fight to ensure that we have a sufficient budget. Now, things can be complicated in space as well. We have a space agency. We have European Space Agents in Paris, which is an international organisation. Then there'll be a space agency of the European Union, and we need to work together. There could be certain member states will be part of one, but not of the other. So it could be difficult, but I will ensure that that agency has the necessary funding.
Okay, now the last speaker is Christian Eller, ITRE coordinator in EPP.
Madame Goulard, you will have 3 important key DGs under your responsibility: DG Connect, Grow, the new DG Defense. I mean, without any irony, that would need a female Hercules. It's unprecedented. We never even touched today 5G development, artificial intelligence, EU industry strategy, the action plan for the military mobility, cybersecurity, not to speak about managing full parts of Horizon Europe, Digital Europe Programme, Galileo, Copernicus, Cosmo, European Defence Fund, the support for the Just Transition Fund. I mean, in all honesty, don't you think that the allegations you might face might be an unbearable burden for you to manage all that? Do you foresee that there will be a time-consuming part of you being part of a judicial procedure, and at the same time you have to deal with all this complexity? And these legal allegations you are facing could terminate besides you, and I really hope that this is not true, and I would even try to believe that. But wouldn't you think that contaminates all these important projects, the cornerstone of European policy? These questions hadn't raised just by us. It had been raised in the public. It was driving the public perception and not policies. And I think that is something you would have to answer.
Madame Goulard.
Merci, Monsieur le Député. Encore une fois.
Well, thank you. There are several questions that have been along those lines, and that's fully legitimate. You're here to check whether the person who's sitting in front of you will be able to fulfill the tasks with which they've been confided. I'm not going to pretend that I'm some kind of superwoman. I just think that you should give people an opportunity. This portfolio was designed by Mrs. von der Leyen. She is responsible for everything that the Commission does as a whole. Mrs. Vestager has to coordinate several fields, Mr. Dombrovskis as well. Well, every member of the Commission will have heavy responsibilities. The Executive Vice President, Mr. Timmermans, as well. I mean, I will do my best. And as I said earlier, there is a link between the modernisation of our industry and our digitalisation. And given that, we may well be able to achieve things that we haven't been able to achieve until this point. Obviously, I'll be working in a collegiate fashion. I'll be working with my services, with you. I mean, how do I see the role of a commissioner? Well, I think you should be the person who can trigger things. Obviously, when it comes to the details, you have to know the files. Sven was here. There are other colleagues who've worked with me. I mean, we went through the entire reform of the financial sector with Burkhard Balz, for example. We did difficult things. They were heavy tasks. You had the financial crisis. Nothing had been done for an awfully long time. There was a light touch regime in place. We established financial regulations. I'll do my best. I can't promise that I'm better than anyone else, but I will do my best to use my skills. Let me conclude by saying one thing that I learnt from a great German woman, Wir schaffen das. We can do it.
Zeller, a follow-up question.
No, thank you.
So, thank you very much, colleagues, for your questions. Now it's the time for Mrs. Goulard, if she wishes to address us with some concluding remarks, up to 5 minutes. So, Madame Goulard.
Julie.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and of course all of the people who are still with us, who may still be with us beyond this room. I wanted to make 3 comments with regard to this exchange. First of all, these hearings are a very good democratic exercise. They don't exist in all political systems, and even in our member states, actually, particularly when people become ministers. So the decision is obviously up to you, but I'm very happy that we've had a debate, even with involving people whose views I don't necessarily share. And this has actually been a courteous and substantial debate, and has also shown that the Commission will be working under the scrutiny of the European Parliament. I also deeply hope that you're going to evaluate and assess a person with a narrative, a history, with strengths and even mistakes. I make mistakes like everybody else, and there are things, Mr. Didier, that we might be able to regret, or things that we might be proud of. It's up to you to judge that. Then, you were interested in verifying my integrity, and obviously you are responsible for the use of European taxpayers' money, so you're quite right to do so. I've brought forward issues of fact, issues pertaining to the law, and there again you might have your own views. But there is an important principle at play here, and that is the assumption of innocence. It's enshrined in the International Fundamental Charter, which is about the values that bring us together, and I think it's important to respect that. If you have decided to put your trust in me, then I will continue to serve the European cause, as I have done for 30 years now, in different jobs, with different people, but always with the same goal, which was the common European interest. Perhaps you know that before they take up office, the commissioners go to the Court of Justice and they swear an oath, and that is a symbol of their probity and of their convictions. And if you say that I am fit to make that oath, then I can say to you that I will be committed to all of those principles and values. And then my last point, I just wanted to say the questions that you put today have covered a very wide spectrum of issues. But that has led me to understand how demanding the role of this Commission is going to be. And we're going to have to double our efforts now. Mr. Bompard said this himself. We have a development model today that is underpinned by carbon, coal, consumption, a certain way of living, moving, eating, producing. And all of this now is being called into question by climate change and by technological evolution. And it's also true that we've been so privileged on this planet for decades, centuries now. We have blithely been able to enjoy all of this. We've been very comfortable. But now the geopolitical situation has changed. Demographic issues, we didn't mention this, have also changed. So the transformation that we're going to have to bring about, if you place your trust in me, is a deep transformation, far-reaching one, which we will have to tackle with great humility, with all the help that we can get. And there's one thing I'm sure of here in this Parliament. You are the drivers of integration. Obviously, in the Member States, there are governments that are in favour as well. But the governments are more concerned with local issues. So sometimes they're a little bit more hesitant with change. But this is a dangerous world. International agreements are being called into question. For example, the Accords on the Environment, the agreement with Iran. There's a world which is perhaps less cooperative today, which will be much more dangerous in the future than it was recently in the past. So we have to be realistic, roll up our sleeves, and as a European, I've always tried to reach out across borders across parties, borders across between countries, the borders mentally between the East and the West and the North and the South, all of the things that have been dragging us down over the last few years. This I will continue with. And my vision for Europe is not just a group of people on one side against another group of people on the other side. No, people who are building bridges between the groups, talking to each other. It's about dialogue, listening and making compromises. Europe is about saying, I'm not going to win 100%, because together we will win together in a better way than we would if we were on our own. And Jean Monnet said, if we bring together people, we will bring together the states. And in the von der Leyen Commission, of course, we'll be bringing together men and women. And I hope you'll be able to place your trust in me. Thank you very much for this exchange.
Now, for a few words, the floor to Madame de Soto.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Commissioner designate for her answers and engaging in this debate with both our committees. Because your portfolio indeed is dealing with so many subjects, that's why we had to organize this hearing with several committees. And I want to note that thanks to the excellent collaboration between the committees, we managed to organize this in a very good way. I want to thank my co-chair, Mrs. Valjan, and also the chairs of Cult and Yuri, who are present here, to have contributed to this meeting. And I will close by giving the floor back to Mrs. Valjan.
I join your thanks to everyone involved in organizing this. Just a few words about what is going to happen next. So we will hold a meeting later today with the coordinators of the two joint committees, ITRE and IMCO, and we will evaluate the performance in this hearing of the Commissioner designate, looking, of course, at, as it is indicated, the general competence, the European commitment, and the personal independence. Thank you very much, Madame Goulard, for being with us today. Thank you very much, colleagues. See you later. Thank you.